you're listening to Conversing the Classics. Today's topic is one of the first major works of Western literature. It follows Ithac and epic hero Odysseus' truncated quest home from the Trojan War. A perilous quest that takes him 10 years to complete. He travels everywhere from the kingdom of the Phaeacians to the mythical island of the Cyclops Polyphemus. All the while, his palace back in Ithaca is invaded by suitors who court his wife, sleep with his maids, and feast in his halls. Joining me today to discuss Homer's Odyssey is Dr. Martine Cuypers, lecturer in Greek at Trinity College Dublin. Dr. Cuypers, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Oscar. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, to add context, I suppose, before we jump into the narrative itself, what century, roughly, is the Odyssey composed?
There are no easy questions when it comes to the background of Homer's Iliad and also the Odyssey. The Odyssey and the Iliad are in the society that they depict a little bit, so like that society are clearly going back to the late Bronze Age. So now you're thinking about the late 12th century BC. But there are also elements that surely belong more in the Dark Age. So generally we sort of put the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey at the end of the 8th century BC. But the world of the Odyssey and the world of the Iliad are really constructs that sort of comprise a number of centuries.
Now, most would ascribe its authorship to the blind poet Homer, a statement that I understand is subject to much debate by scholars. Do you believe there was one single author of the text? And more specifically, do we have any sort of evidence to suggest that Homer was a real person and that he did indeed compose these texts?
Another difficult question. What you're referring to, Oscar, is the so-called Homeric question. Was there a person called Homer? And if there was a person called Homer, did he compose both the Iliad and the Odyssey? And if so, did he compose the complete poems or bits of it? And were they edited, or was there a committee called Homer? Scholars in the 19th century were very worked up about that question, and they spent long hours and lots of ink on trying to separate bits and pieces of the individual poems and have a compositor A and a compositor B and think about which bits were composed by which poets and which bits were newer and older. It is definitely true that the Odyssey and the Iliad are the product of long oral traditions, because the language of the poems is an artificial language which is made for and by the hexameter and developed over a long period of time. And it is also clear that the Iliad and the Odyssey sort of include elements that may go a long way back, and then elements that may have been composed perhaps for a different context, such as the catalogue of ships in the Iliad, or maybe bits of the Telemachus in the Odyssey. But it is quite clear that the plots and the composition, the overall structure of the poems is so complex and so sophisticated that it's very hard to imagine, but most modern scholars would agree on that they are not the work of one brilliant, sophisticated bard or poet. And it may well be the case that the Odyssey poet was different from the Iliad poet. But on the whole, I think in scholarship is generally agreed that we should be thinking about a brilliant composition by a single person.
Right. So I suppose moving on to talk about the text itself, Odysseus as a character is often given the Greek simile polytropos. Despite this, he still makes several blunders and returns home with none of his troops. How is it that he's still considered the most intelligent and quick-witted classical hero despite these blunders?
Yeah, the blunders. We'll talk about that in a second, I think. It's good to start looking at Odysseus by just looking at the beginning of the epic. And if you look at the first lines that the poet gives to us, he starts with Andra moyene pemusa polytropon hosmala pola plankte, epeitroies hierontolietron e perse, polondanthropon idenastia, kainon egno. And that translates more or less as, tell me, muse, of the man of many turns, who has driven far journeys, after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were they whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of, many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he tried. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. If you start analyzing those first lines, then a number of things really jump out immediately. First, there's this qualification of Odysseus as the man of many turns. And there are a number of aspects to that. So on the one hand, he is the man of many turns because he wandered much, as is explained in the line that follows. But he's also the man of many turns, polytropos, because he is versatile, he's mentally agile. He has this practical intelligence. And that practical intelligence is very much a product of his journey. So the wanderings and the man that he has become very much go together. And it is his experience learning the mind and cities of many men while he was traveling back from Troy that made him into wily Odysseus, the hero that we know. Another aspect that's also quite clear from the beginning of the poem is the biased nature of the narrative. So the poet is not neutral. So in the Iliad, you get a very dramatic, or a tragic picture, you might say. So the Trojans are about as sympathetic as the Greeks, and you might say in some ways even more sympathetic. So the real hero, you could say, of the Iliad is not Achilles, but it's Hector, the man who sadly dies, and with him Troy will die. In the Odyssey, the poet is very clear about good guys and bad guys. So Odysseus and all who support him are the good guys. And then everyone who opposes Odysseus is bad, or everyone who causes trouble for Odysseus. And this emphasis on that it was really his comrade's own fault, his companion's own stupidity, not listening to the instructions that caused their death, is a very good example of this. So the poet is constantly pleading Odysseus free, despite the fact that at many places in the narrative you sort of get the feeling that, well, if you would look at it from a different perspective, which is not the perspective of the narrator, you could also come up with a very different version of the events.
And do you think then that this idea that there is a right and wrong in the Iliad, or in the Odyssey, is because it's acting almost as a moral example to its readers in Greece, in the ancient world, that it's trying to say this is how a good Greek should behave, and in doing that they sort of have to put forward a good guy?
Well, that gets us very much to the themes, I think, of the poem. I would be quite wary about seeing Odysseus as an ideal example of Greekness and ideal behavior and heroism, because he is in many ways a slightly problematic hero. He has clear values, very true, but he makes mistakes. Sometimes he makes choices that seem to be fairly morally dubious. He takes revenge in a horrendous way at the end of the poem, and it's clear that the people in Ithaca are not on board, are not okay with what he has done there. He is quite cocky and quite unfriendly with the Cyclops. I think it's not a very nice thing to do, and whatever kind of an ogre the Cyclops may be, Odysseus just goes into his cave, starts eating the cheese, and then also wants a guest gift. And you might think, well, sure, there are the laws of hospitality and they apply to everyone, but do you really have to push it this far, right? So in that sense, I think we are definitely creating a picture of Greek values and what it means to be Greek, and that's one of the key themes, I think, of the Odyssey. But Odysseus' place within that constellation and within that discourse is not entirely unproblematic, even if the narrator pretends that it is. If you think about themes, then it is, in the end, I think so. There are lots of Greek values that are important. Hospitality, of course, it would be a key one, because it keeps coming back time and again throughout the poem. But if you dig below those motives and the smaller themes and the values, then you eventually come, I think, at the choice that Odysseus makes. And in the Iliad, it's very easy to see that it is about the choice of Achilles. So Achilles must choose to either have a very long life but no glory, and in the end, therefore, have a shorter life than he could have had, you might say, or he must fight, rejoin the battle. He will die young, but he will have eternal fame through poetry. So the Iliad is very much about the human condition. And the Odyssey in its own way is also about the human condition. Because Odysseus too has a choice to make. We find him in Book 5 on the island of Calypso, the nymph who lives in the middle of nowhere. And she is immortal. And she is beautiful. She even promises to make him immortal. And he decides to not take that offer. And that's the choice that he makes.
Mm. You've kind of touched on various aspects of Odysseus's voyage throughout the text, but considering it is about his voyage home, it's not told in chronological order. Why is this?
If you would ask that question to Aristotle, then he would say because the Odyssey has a real plot. So Aristotle, one of our first, perhaps the first serious literary critic, was very much preoccupied with epic being a sort of precursor to tragedy. And he said that the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are very much like a tragedy in that they have a clear plot. They have a relatively short time span, in both cases about 40 days. So the action of the poem that's being narrated at the primary level is about 40 days. And everything that happens before and after is woven in, but it's not part of the plot of the epic. And in the Odyssey, the narration is really not about the home journey of Odysseus, which took a long time and took 10 years, but it is about the homecoming of Odysseus. And within that framework, the narrative of the homecoming of 40 days, we have inserted a number of sort of occasions or opportunities to create a picture of the longer journey. And one of those elements is Odysseus' narrative of everything that happens before he landed at the Phaeacians. So that's books 8 through 12. But we also have, in books 1 through 4, his son Telemachus going off in search of his father and giving us a picture of the homecomings, not only of Odysseus, because, well, that's what he wants to hear, but he doesn't hear it, he doesn't get the information. But he does hear about the homecoming of Nestor, the homecoming of Menelaus, the homecoming of Agamemnon, who becomes a sort of foil for Odysseus. So the horrible experience that Agamemnon had on his homecoming becomes like a fear for what could happen to Odysseus. And in that way, the poet has sort of inserted a wider context, and in essence just a story of the homecomings of the Greeks after Troy at large, within the context of his narrative of 40 days, which is quite brilliant in many ways.
Yeah. Now, we don't actually meet Odysseus until, I think it's book 5, if I've got that right. Instead, the first 4 books are centred around Odysseus' son Telemachus, or Telemachus, as he desperately searches for not just his father's whereabouts, but also his own identity. Can you tell us a little bit more about Telemachus and the significance of the first 4 books?
Those first 4 books are among the parts of the Odyssey that people who are worried about the Homeric question have not rarely seen as like elements of the poem that didn't really belong there, that have been put in from somewhere else, etc. But if you look at their function, they're actually very clever. So apart from giving us a wider picture of the homecomings of the Greek heroes at large after Troy, they also give us an introduction to Odysseus through his son. Because in those 4 books, we hear everyone talking about Odysseus and comparing Odysseus or comparing Telemachus to Odysseus. And in the course of those 4 books, Telemachus, journeying first to Nestor and Pylos and to Menelaus and Sparta, is sort of like slowly but surely coming of age. So he is finding his own identity by hearing about his father, by constantly being compared to his father, and he grows to become a figure who can stand beside his father at the end of the poem, where they together take revenge on the suitors in the Megaron in book 22.
Now, something you mentioned a little earlier was the significance of the comparison between Agamemnon and Odysseus. Does Telemachus then resemble Orestes in the terms of he is almost taking revenge for the people who have wronged his father, or is that a shaky comparison?
No, it's not a shaky comparison at all. It's a comparison that's constantly invited by the poets. In book 4, Telemachus does hear about the homecoming of Agamemnon, told by Menelaus, and about the role of Orestes as the avenger of his father. And he sort of imagines himself, and the poet imagines him, as a potential Orestes. So the thought is seeded into our minds that Telemachus may have to do something similar to what Orestes did. It's quite complex because, of course, the two stories are not entirely parallel, but Telemachus definitely considers the possibility that he must become an Orestes and other characters. So that creates that scenario for him. Fortunately, his mother, Penelope, is not Clytemnestra, and therefore it does not come out that way. And eventually Telemachus does take revenge, but in a very different kind of context.
Now, something that does plague both Odysseus and Telemachus' journey is the role of the gods, principally Athena and Poseidon. What is the significance of divine intervention within the Odyssey, and particularly in relevance to Telemachus and Odysseus?
Let's start by lifting that to quite a high level. In the Iliad, the divine world is quite complicated. So there are many gods involved who are each taking sides, who are based on what they experienced before. So the judgment of Paris is very important in motivating the support of certain gods for certain parties. In the Odyssey, it's quite simplified. We are dealing effectively with three gods, with Athena, who is the helper of Odysseus and his family, with Poseidon, who is opposing Odysseus, and with Zeus, who is mediating between the two and keeping an eye on the overall proceedings. He's the mediator. Athena is there for Odysseus and for Telemachus all along the way. And even if Odysseus, when he comes home to Ithaca, sort of like grumbles and tells Athena, like, where were you all the time? She was there all the time. Telemachus is being supported by Athena in the guise of Mentes and Mentor. So in human disguise, she accompanies him on his journey and stands beside him along the way and sort of like supervises his quest for Odysseus and his growth into a man from a boy. Odysseus and Athena are a very wonderful couple, and Telemachus, in a sense, because he is so much like Odysseus and becoming like Odysseus, fits into that pattern as well. So the metis, the practical intelligence that Athena represents, is embodied by Odysseus, and therefore they're a very good match. And when we see them together in the homecoming scene in Ithaca, where Athena tries to approach Athena in disguise, and Athena immediately sort of pricks through the disguise and recognizes her, there's some pondering about the similarity in spirit and the similarity in character between the goddess Athena and the hero Odysseus.
Now, something else that you touched on in terms of the Cyclops visit is the idea of gift giving and the guest-host relationship. Could you delve into that a little bit more and how that affects the Odyssey as a whole, or what the significance it is to the narrative?
Yeah. Hospitality is sort of like seminal sort of value for the Odyssey as a whole. And as a theme, it runs all the way from the beginning to the end. We see at the beginning of Book 1, the suitors of Penelope, Odysseus' wife, abusing the hospitality of his palace, the hospitality of his wife in Ithaca. And that is the beginning of a number of different sort of like incarnations and takes on and reflections about hospitality. So we have like examples of like abuse of hospitality with the suitors. We have the companions of Odysseus, like eating the cattle of the sun, which effectively is also an abuse of hospitality. We have the Cyclops, who doesn't acknowledge the existence of the gods and doesn't follow the rules of hospitality, or promises Odysseus a very like lugubrious guest gift of eating him last after all of his companions. And then we have examples of ideal hospitality. We have the Phaeacians, who on Scheria are hosting Odysseus in an exemplary fashion and who are very much like the foils of the Cyclops. So they're the opposite example, ideal hospitality versus terrible inhospitality. We see back the hospitality situation again in Ithaca in the second half of the epic, where we find Odysseus travel to his own palace, disguised as a beggar, and being received very inhospitably, very inappropriately by the suitors who, despite the fact that they are guests themselves, are here playing the role of very bad hosts.
So obviously the suitors play a big role, and whilst Telemachus is searching for his father, Penelope, Odysseus' wife, is left in Ithaca with I think it's 108 of them. Despite all the unwanted attention, Penelope remains faithful to her husband. This does raise some questions about the role of a wife and the freedom allowed to women in the ancient world. What does Penelope's character tell us about the role of women in Greek society?
You have to be very careful with that, because Greek society is a very wide term, and there is no such a thing as Greek society. Very often when we are thinking about women in Greek society, we are looking at classical Athens, periods and location for which we have the largest number of sources. And in classical Athens, women are very much confined to the household, and they are only going outside festivals and funerals, and maybe if they don't have the money to pay the servant or to have a servant to do the shopping, and they have no public role whatsoever. They are under the control of their husband, who is their kurios, and they don't really play any role within society at large. In the Odyssey, we find something different, which is quite remarkable and also quite beautiful in many ways. When in Book 6, Nausicaa and Odysseus are conversing about marriage and the relationship between husband and wife, it is made clear that the ideal marriage is one in which husband and wife are functioning as partners. They're working together in a household, in a team, to make sure that the household does well, to produce an heir, to manage the household, etc. And Penelope takes that role very seriously, and she's very good at it. And Penelope and Odysseus are a very good match. So just like Odysseus and Athena can be compared, so Odysseus and Penelope are characters who share quite a few traits and qualities and values. And we see culminate that at the end of the poem when Odysseus finally reveals his identity to her, tests him in a very clever way and comes out on top. So Odysseus doesn't realize that he's being tested, and Penelope proves to be just as intelligent, if not more intelligent, than her husband. So in that sense, the ideal situation, the ideal relationship as it is sketched in Book 6 is being implemented, is shown in reality at the end of the epic.
There's something that's interesting you say there about Penelope takes on the role of being the perfect wife and the perfect housekeeper really, really well. While she's doing that, it is noteworthy that Odysseus is off and he has affairs left, right and centre. He's offered to marry Nausicaa, if I remember correctly. Is almost the poet saying in a little way that Penelope is better because she's keeping faithful despite all this temptation, or how would you view that?
That's a very good question. Again, the narrator, let's call him Homer, would not agree with that, right? So Homer at no point casts doubt on Odysseus' behavior, but it is clear that there are double standards. So what Penelope is not allowed to do, sleep with the suitors, Odysseus has been doing for, quite a long time. He almost ends up with Nausicaa, and he spends a long time with Calypso. And Calypso, so the stay with Calypso is something that we should really come back to some extent, because it is quite remarkable. So when we see Odysseus at the beginning of Book 5, after all this suspense has been raised, so we have heard everyone talk about Odysseus for 4 books, then we finally find Odysseus at the beginning of Book 5 on the island of Calypso, with whom he's been having, let's just call it an affair, because that's what it is. And still, he's pining on the beach. So he's sitting at the seaside, looking out, hoping to see smoke rise from Ithaca. And we know that's not going to happen because the island Ogygia, where Calypso lives, is in the middle of nowhere. And when the herald of the gods, Hermes, comes at the beginning of book 5 to say you need to now let Odysseus go, then she comments on that, right? So long time no see, no one ever comes here. And Odysseus is in a rather odd situation. So on the one hand, it's very nice to have an immortal goddess for a consort, but he's living there in the middle of nowhere. And if we then think about the choice that he needs to make, then it is quite clear, even if the poet and the poem does not make it explicit, is that he makes the human choice. So when Calypso asks him, but why do you want to go? So am I not more beautiful than Penelope? And did I not offer you immortality? He doesn't really have an answer, but he still chooses for Penelope. He chooses to go home to Ithaca. And if you sort of dig underneath and start thinking about why that might be the case, then you sort of land with the thought that in the end, being immortal on the island of Calypso is not satisfactory for a human being. Because how does a human being sort of live on? That is in memory. Just like the Iliad is the song about Achilles and sort of immortalizes Achilles, so Odysseus, he needs to enjoy the immortality that is there, that is available to mortals. It is partly the immortality of family. So living in your son, who will have a son, and therefore sort of your family will live on after you. And partly he needs to cash in on all the hard work that he's done. So he has acquired all this fame and this reputation. People are talking about Odysseus. And if he lives with Calypso in the middle of nowhere, where no one ever comes and where he can't hear people talk about him, he, in essence, all that he has done in the past 20 years is for nothing. So if you look at it from that perspective, then Odysseus' choice becomes quite understandable. It is the human choice. And in the end, therefore, this is a poem about the human condition, just like the Iliad.
Well, before we actually move on to talk about what happens when Odysseus gets home, the other significant event or happening within the book, which we've only sort of danced around the edges, is his stay with the Phaeacians. What place does that hold in the Odyssey and his sort of almost affair with Nausicaa and his relationship with King Alcinous? What does all that play into to the themes and the significance of the narrative?
The stay with the Phaeacians it's important within the development of the theme of hospitality within the epic, as we already discussed. It also gives Odysseus yet another choice. So just like he could have stayed with Calypso on Ogygia, he could have taken what was on offer with the Phaeacians. He could have become Alcinous' son-in-law. He could have married Nausicaa, but he decides not to do that. So there too, the same motive more or less is being repeated in a slight, it's varied, you might say. In many ways, that is how the epic operates. So quite a few situations are coming back a number of times in different guises and are being varied, are being played upon. And it is very much, you might say, something that comes out of the oral origins of epic, in which repetition is almost given with oral composition. And the poet of the Odyssey has sort of made it productive in a literary sense.
Right. Well, now down to the sort of the big part of the epic, or the most important part. When Odysseus returns to Ithaca in book 13, he disguises himself as a beggar. Why is it that he doesn't just walk straight into the palace and say, I'm home? Why does he have to play it out in these it's about 5 books, I think?
We heard at the beginning of the epic that Odysseus is the man who got wise from experience, and at a number of points he experienced in the course of his travels that revealing your identity can lead to all kinds of accidents. Most importantly, of course, he revealed his identity to the Cyclops, Polyphemus, and it was that mistake which allowed the Cyclops to invoke his father, Poseidon, the god Poseidon, and put a curse on Odysseus, and for that reason, Odysseus' homecoming was delayed by a long time, and Odysseus had all kinds of troubles because of that mistake. So he is avoiding that mistake when he comes home in Ithaca, and he doesn't storm immediately into the palace, but he tests the waters, being disguised as a beggar. So he first goes to his swineherd, the loyal Eumaeus, and he sort of like he finds helpers initially. So Eumaeus himself, Telemachus, shows up as well in the end, and in that way he infiltrates into the palace to set up what Nick Lowe, who has thought about the Odyssey in terms of like game theory, has called the end game of the Odyssey.
And that end game is now what we come on to. Finally, Telemachus, who knows that it is his father, they block the suitors within the hall, and both of them set to work about slaughtering them. Once the slaughter is complete, they decide to further their cleansing, in inverted commas, of the royal house by slaughtering the young maids who served the suitors banquets and had affairs with them. We're provided with quite a graphic image in the poem as they are hung, and it's described, I quote now, this is the Penguin Classics translation, "For a little while their feet kicked, but not for very long." Is this designed to create a sort of sympathy for the maids and the suitors? And are these sort of actions that Telemachus and Odysseus commit slightly excessive?
From a neutral perspective, you could well say that. And this brings us back more or less to where we started, the biased nature of the narrative. So Homer does not tell us that Odysseus is being quite harsh and goes quite far in his revenge. But he does sketch that picture, that graphic picture of the feet dangling, all the blood in the Megaron that needs to be cleaned up, the murder spree that Telemachus and Odysseus engage on the threshold of the Megaron, just raining arrows inside. And this is one of those cases where you could easily ask, as a neutral observer, are we being given a biased picture? It is the case that at the very end of the epic, the goddess Athena needs to intervene to prevent further slaughter, because the family members of the suitors are not okay with what has happened there in the Megaron, and they want revenge on Odysseus and his family. And we find in Book 24, Odysseus, his son Telemachus, and his father Laertes in a little triangle or trinity, together, ready to take on the suitors' relatives. And then the goddess Athena decides it's enough, and she intervenes and she establishes peace. The fact that it came that far and that the goddess had to intervene may tell you something about sort of the values within the poem. And Odysseus is not entirely unproblematic within the value system of the poet. And the very end of the poem again brings that home to us, just like the beginning did.
Finally, this action comes to a close. Well, obviously, you mentioned there a bit about Book 24, so I don't think we need to go into that, because there is actually debate as to whether the Book 24 was added later on.
That's true, that's true. So 24 is one of the parts of the epic that are analytics, so the people who want to split up Homer into a committee have seen as a later addition, or something that was added by someone else, or it's like spliced in at a fairly late stage in the composition. That part of the epic fulfills an important function. In antiquity, already people said, well, the epic really should have ended when Odysseus and Penelope went to bed together in Book 23. But Book 24 sort of wraps up a number of loose ends, and lots of loose ends once you start thinking about it. And you could say that it gives you a sort of curtain call of key characters, key motives, key themes of the epic, in such a way that at the end of the poem, at the end of Book 24, you really have the feeling that it's been wrapped up, it's over, it's done. So we find we have another meeting with Agamemnon, whom the suitors meet in the underworld. So like the story of Agamemnon and Orestes and Penelope as a foil to the story of Odysseus and Telemachus, and Penelope is being wrapped up, and the hospitality theme is wrapped up, and there are lots of different bits and pieces. So once you start thinking about that, then the book really does make sense.
Now, we talked about it a little bit, but I want to go into a little bit more detail about it because it is sort of the big closing part of the epic. Penelope and Odysseus are reunited, but not before Penelope decides to test Odysseus. Can you tell us a little bit more about the story, how it unfolds, and really about the significance to the characters of both Penelope and Odysseus?
We are at the moment when Telemachus and Odysseus have killed the suitors, and Odysseus now reveals his identity and says, "I'm really your husband. Didn't you recognize me?" And no, indeed she didn't. Penelope is not immediately convinced and tests Odysseus in a rather clever way. She says, "Okay, so I accept you're my husband Odysseus. Let's go to bed together." And then she gives instructions to the staff to put the bed outside the bedchamber and to make it ready for sleeping and for the reunion of husband and wife. And Odysseus then gets completely flustered and upset and angry. So who moved the bed? So what happened? You can't move the bed. I know it's not possible to move the bed because he built the bed, and that's part of his character as well. So his practical intelligence also translates in craftsmanship. And as a good craftsman, as a good carpenter, he built the bed around the stump of a tree, so the trunk of a tree, in such a way that the bed is actually part of the house, so the bed can't be moved. And he gets really upset. And that's, of course, the sign, because who would know that that is the case except Odysseus? And at that moment, Penelope accepts that he is indeed Odysseus. This is the ultimate victory of wife over husband, you might say. It is the evidence that Penelope all along was a match for her husband. And it's a lovely, lovely end to sort of that part of the epic. And you can sort of see how in antiquity critics thought that it should have ended there, because it's a very romantic moment and it's a very satisfactory moment.
So to wrap things all up, if I could leave this podcast with only 3 facts about the Odyssey, what would they be?
3. It's always difficult to reduce.
No one likes this question.
No, I know, and I've answered it before. If you had to reduce this to 3 points, I would say the first point should be that every bit of the Odyssey matters. So there are no details, there are no episodes, there are no mythological details, backstories, digressions in the epic that not at some level are making a contribution to the overarching plot, narrative, characterization. So do take it seriously, and it can be a bit of a drag and a bit of a trek to read the entire epic, and it's very easy to focus on the highlights and the purple passages and the moments that we all like, but the story of Telemachus at the beginning does really matter, and without that we don't have the Telemachus we have at the end. The scenes, the narrative of Odysseus, of his journeys in books 8 through 12, apart from the fact that there's lovely moments like the Cyclops, it really does matter because it gives you an indication of how he became the man that he is, etc. So take it seriously. Don't take it apart, but read it as unified, as an epic designed to be as it is. Another point I think to keep in mind is the bias of the narration. Don't necessarily trust Homer. If Homer tells you things and he takes the side of Odysseus and he tells you that the suitors are nasty people and Odysseus' companions are stupid, don't necessarily believe the guy, and try to walk in the shoes of those other guys and ask yourself, if you were the Cyclops and you were in your cave, you were coming home from a hard day's shepherding, and you would find this guy with his comrades in arms in your cave eating your cheese, what would you do? Right? Well, you would probably not eat them, but you might also not be well pleased to find Odysseus there. So see it from another perspective. Finally, the human condition again. So think about why Odysseus really wants to go home, and there's no easy answer to that, but that question, as an open question, is very important for understanding what the epic is about in the end. the human condition, choices that Odysseus makes, the importance of fame, the importance of family, the importance of offspring, perpetuating your line for human beings, and try to place that alongside what's happening in the Iliad and see that eventually the Odyssey, just like the Iliad, is about what it means to be mortal. So the fact that we all die and that we are not gods. And in the end, that aspect of Greek epic is very universal. So if you're looking at other cultures, if you're looking at the Gilgamesh epic, for example, it is also about mortality. So the hero Gilgamesh, who at the end of his epic stands in front of the walls of Uruk, realizes that he is not going to live forever because he has not found the source of immortality, but he will live on in the walls of his city, Uruk, the city that he founded, which will stand forever. And unfortunately, the city now no longer stands, so that didn't come true. But you can see how that works.
Yeah.
So that's, in the end, what Greek epic and much of epic is about.
Well, that brings us really nicely to the end of the podcast. Dr. Cuypers, thank you so much for providing such a great discussion on the Odyssey. If you at home enjoyed the podcast and want to find out more about what we do at Classical Youth Society of Ireland, you can contact us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland. Follow us on Twitter @CYSI_, or for any direct inquiry, you can email us cysiofficial@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. Today's podcast was edited by Michael Fuller, and I'll catch you all next time.